You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Paul Lewis, Policy Director at the Eno Center for Transportation. Paul discusses their report on transportation construction costs, saving time and making sense, a blueprint for building transit better. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous, amazing Patreon supporters. It's 2022, and we're celebrating 8 years of the Talking Headways podcast. So to join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $10 a month will still get you a bus-only scarf. I promise I'm still working on new designs and formats. $2 a month will get you stickers and a handwritten note, but any support is welcome and much appreciated. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of The Overhead Wire. Whether it's our daily newsletter first established in 2006 or our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning and Practice, find out more today at theoverheadwire.com. Paul Lewis, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. My name is Paul Lewis. I'm the Policy Director at the Eno Center for Transportation. For those of you that don't know Eno, we're an independent think tank based in Washington, D.C. We focus on transportation, everything transportation, specifically public policy, up and down the Federalist chain. And we've got work that spans all different modes and all different types of transportation. And we've been really recently looking at why does it take so long and cost so much to build public transit in this country? It's a big question, and I think duly important right now, and something that we've been spending a lot of time talking about with folks.
So what got you interested in transportation? Was it something that happened when you were a little kid, or was it something that happened when you were older and kind of figuring out how to travel around? How did that come about?
I've always liked transportation. It's always been of interest to me. I actually went and got my degree in engineering because I thought that was the way to get involved in building bridges and railroads and roads and all those kind of things. And engineers do great work, but I found it a little unsatisfying because, for example, we would design a road and all of the things associated with the pavement depths and the culvert sizes, but nobody asked, well, why are we building the road in the first place? And that kind of drew me more towards the planning and operations and public policy side of transportation. I got my master's degree in that area, and I've been here in DC and studying public policy and working on public policy ever since.
That's interesting. I mean, we talk about that in the transit world a lot about, building projects and then whether we should build them. I have a couple of questions about that in a second, but I think that's just like a fascinating question of not how we can design it or whether we can design it. It's whether it should be designed or built. But here, you mentioned this before, but you've been working and putting together a cost database for transit projects over the last few years. What got the project started and why is it important?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a story in the New York Times a couple of years ago that was talking about the most expensive mile of subway on Earth, and specifically the Second Avenue subway, spurred in part by some independent work that others have done, Alon Levy and others that have kind of looked at this issue of, why does it take so much to build transit, specifically here in the US? And we had some funders and some partners reach out to us and say, let's see if we can kind of crack this nut and answer a couple of questions. And first, is there a systemic problem outside of New York, kind of looking US wide? And if so, what is the root cause of it? And is there anything we can do about it? And so those were our big research questions. And so we spent a lot of time working through the data piece, trying to, again, in a high level, figure out how the US compares to other developed countries, other democracies around the world. We started mostly making comparisons to places in Canada and Europe, where, of course, there is a definite premium. We've expanded that and included other places in South America and Southeast Asia and South Africa, other independent democracies that again, seem to have a consistently lower cost and faster timeline than we do here in the United States when building rail.
Did you all look at the history of kind of cost escalation? I know from my own interest anyways, I've always been interested in kind of the evolution of urban transit projects and the move from, say, these metro systems that we started thinking about in the 50s and 60s, and then going up through light rail in 1981 with San Diego and, the progression to bus rapid transit, all those things. I'm curious if you all kind of looked back at the history of this a little bit. I know it's not part of the scope of work necessarily, but it's interesting to see those cost increases and how those have impacted kind of what we're building.
For sure. And, if you look at the history of building mass transit and rail transit in this country, I mean, we used to build a lot of it very, very cheaply, right? And if you look at most American cities had a pretty extensive streetcar network. A lot of them had subways. A lot of those built pre-1950 at a fairly reasonable cost. I think things started to get a little bit more expensive, for sure. We really looked at the last 20 years, just trying to get a flavor for what's happening right now and what can we do about it right now. But I think the history piece is important. And the high costs, to your last point, definitely influence how we make decisions today. And that's why, because things cost so much, that's why we see a lot of new rail transit that's going down the middle of a highway median or in a abandoned freight rail right-of-way, because that's the easiest place to put transit. Sometimes it's a good place, and it's not always a good place. And I think we end up kind of forcing our decisions based on what's easiest and not necessarily what's best for the potential riders and for accessibility.
Yeah, because it's interesting to look back on how much, say, that 1981 project cost, and I think it's around somewhere in the $15 million a mile in 1981 dollars, kind of cost, and now we're looking at $250 million a mile for surface light rail, $200 million a mile, and so I think that's something that, as you mentioned, it's this progression, and it's frustrating, especially when it's driving the decisions on alignments and things like that. I'm curious also what the process was for collecting data for this project, and how hard is it to find data that actually is comparable between systems?
A perennial issue, right? We spent a lot of time. We have some really, really good data staff that spent a good portion of last year looking through construction trade magazines, looking through public and publicly available information to try and get final costs, right? And that's also a challenge with this, is that the costs are reported at the beginning, estimated, and then there's usually some midpoint costs and things change. So you got to find that end cost. And then you have to find all the other data. How many stations? How much of it is elevated? How much of it is tunneled, right? Because all of that really matters to making an apples to apples comparison. And it's never going to be perfect. And there's always a lot of caveats on the data, but I think it is helpful. I mean, we have now 250 projects in our database that do help to bring a large enough sample size so that we can say with some certainty that there are kind of systemic issues. Now, there certainly are some inexpensive projects in this country, but they're few and hard to find. We also did make some adjustments for inflation based on producer price indexes. We also made some adjustments for currency based on purchasing price parity. We talk about that pretty extensively in our methodology there in the paper, but again, trying to bring some of those comparisons back to the US so the US can look at these other places and say, this is achievable. And I think that's really the main point with a lot of the data.
You all looked at, kind of data from Canada, Western Europe, and I was wondering why not a global database? I know first thing is probably a lot of work and a lot more money, but the second thing, I'm curious why some of the other, countries weren't included.
Well, so, and, I touched on this briefly earlier, but we had to constrain ourselves a little bit. And we wanted to start with Western Europe because that's how policymakers in this country, in Canada, if we're going to look in some kind of a mirror, we tend to use Western Europe as a comparator, for better or for worse. That tends to be a baseline. And we knew that there were some examples in Western Europe of some very dense cities that were building some very complex projects at very low cost compared to what we do in the United States. So I think there was a good story to tell there. We are about to release a second paper in this series that expanded that remit. And we've expanded that database as well. We included South Korea and Japan and Chile and Australia, Italy, South Africa, right? Other democracies. We wanted a democratic type government where there is some kind of community democratic participation, right? That's kind of important to make a comparison to the US. And I didn't mention Mexico as another one, our neighbor to the south, who's built a lot of transit over the last few decades too, to expand that horizon. And when you include those countries, the gulf between the US and the international comparators only increases.
Were there any interesting projects that you found out about that you might not have known about before?
That's a good question. The Chileans actually I was surprised to find by far the lowest costs in the world. The city of Santiago has built an impressive amount of subway in the past 2 decades, and they average at about $125 to $150 million per mile fully tunneled. And that is better than any other place we've been able to find, at least in the democratic part of the world. And that was really surprising because no one's really written, I think, a lot on the Chilean example and their tremendous success. The Norwegians also have a penchant for building lower cost transit. And so we've really looked into their model. And the South Koreans also have some really good examples of low cost projects.
I think project costs are a frustration for a lot of advocates and professionals. But how do people outside of the kind of the people that pay attention really closely to this stuff, how much do you think that they care? And how much do you think that this, aside from like those New York Times articles, how much do you think this discussion spills out over into regular discourse?
So I think it definitely spills out into regular discourse when there is a specific project and there's a specific problem with it, right? And we've seen this with the Purple Line here in Maryland or in other cities that are building light rail or heavy rail. And there's always a big estimate and it's a couple $2 billion and everyone's like, okay, we're going to get with this project. And then they get down the road and okay, well, it's going to cost so many $1 billion more. And we're seeing this in New York City right now. And there does tend to be a lot of frustration. Why can we not crack this nut? And we all know what it means is not that, the transit's not necessarily going to get built, that specific project, but that means that there's going to be less money for other projects that are just as important in other places in the country.
I guess that's a frustration too, is that, if we figured out how to reduce costs, there would be more money for other projects, or at least there would be more transit construction, fixed guideway transit construction around the country. And it's interesting to think about how much kind of we lose out on by having these extra costs come into play.
For sure.
I want to ask about projects that take longer and cost more in the US, but I know the answer is going to be kind of, it's complicated and there's not a clear answer. So instead, I'll ask why it feels like the feds, agencies, elected leaders, construction companies, consultants, they tend to let this kind of slide and they let it go, and they've let it go for a number of years. I'm wondering why that's the case.
It's a good question. I think part of it is that it's been a slow growing problem, right? It's not like all of a sudden one day construction costs were expensive. I think over time, it's kind of gradually crept up on us, and it's really become apparent in the last 5 or so years that this is a really major problem. I also feel like there's, the kind of a general acceptance of, oh, this is what it's going to cost. And, sorry, there's not much we can do about it. There's also, and I don't know if this is really related to your question, but I'm going to talk about it anyway.
Feel free.
Yeah, well, there's a difference between the scrutiny on transit projects versus their counterparts in the highway world. And perhaps maybe this is something that you want us to talk about more in a little bit. But I think it's important to kind of recognize when we embarked on this, a couple of people said, and we found it to be true, there's a lot of public scrutiny and discussion about what a transit costs at the beginning, middle, and end of its life. And there's a lot of press about it. But there's very little on the highway side. And actually finding data about what a highway project cost at the end of its construction is really difficult. I think Utah is the only state that publishes post-construction final costs of its highway project. And so it makes it hard to scrutinize. And maybe that's because we build a lot of highway projects and comparatively fewer transit projects. But there's a significantly less amount of scrutiny and knowledge, frankly, about what it costs on the highway side. I do think that there's a lot we can learn from highway DOTs and how they build projects, because they're actually pretty adept at doing it. And we can get into that in a little bit. But I wanted to make that point too. It's not, this is talking about infrastructure broadly. I think it's becoming more expensive. We know more about transit because transit's at least a little bit more transparent on what this ends up costing at the end of the day.
Do you think it's in part because our schools, our institutions there's an inertia towards roads, and there's ultimately going to be more people focused on that subject and the delivery of those projects? And transit projects specifically, there's not as much expertise. I'm not going to say there's not a lot of it, because there is a lot of it, but there's not as much expertise. So every state DOT has a road building, process, and they do it, but not every state DOT also builds a light rail project.
Well, and that's actually getting into some of our findings, right, is that the governance piece matters. Highway DOTs, state DOTs, those were designed and built as institutions to build the interstate highway system. Most of them were created in the 50s and 60s, or not sooner than that, but really kind of organized around building big projects. And then transit agencies were designed and built around operating big systems. And so we take an institution that's designed to operate something, and then once a decade we say, oh, go build a mega project, right? And they don't necessarily have the governance and the institutional capacity and structure to do that, whereas highway departments, right, are designed to build those big things. they don't always have the capacity to operate things in the same way. We see that played out on the highways a lot. And so in that paradigm, one of the things that we found is there is an advantage to learning from state DOTs. One of our case studies was comparing the 495 hot lanes built here in Virginia and comparing that to the Silver Line that goes out to Dulles Airport. Two projects built in the median of a highway, kind of similar parameters, similar distances, and frankly, similar costs. And we interviewed people involved with both projects and found very different processes and different culture approaches to these projects than we were anticipating.
It's interesting. There's been a flurry of news stories about the transfer of design or building to state DOTs or other entities away from transit agencies, or even, say, the Met Council in Minneapolis. Last week, there was a bill, I think, filed to kind of take away authority from the Met Council and put it towards the DOT and for the extension of the Blue Line. And then also there was an article yesterday in Salt Lake City Weekly about how there's folks there that want to move the construction from the transit agency or the local DOT to the state DOT, the Utah DOT. And so that's an interesting thing, although I think a lot of transit advocates are worried about that. It'll make the process a little bit watered down or give the transit less of a voice, I guess, if transit itself doesn't have a voice. But you know what I mean, the advocacy around it, the pressure around it. But it's interesting in the report, you also mentioned that DOTs interact with environmental regulations differently. They go faster, they can get things done. You also suggest that alternatives analysis kind of are troublesome. And so maybe there's a way that the state DOTs can teach us something about that as well.
We talked, like I said, we talked to folks that did planning and building of highways and folks that did planning and building of transit. I'll use the NEPA environmental process as an example. When you talk to the folks that build and do this for highways, it's very methodical. It's like, okay, you make sure you got your record clean and you go and you do this, and there's this community engagement piece, and it's like, it's very methodical. Sometimes you get sued, and when you get sued, you rely on your record, and then at the end of the day, you get a record decision, and it's either yes or no. And it was very much like a engineering methodical mindset. We've done this a million times. It's a fine process. We'll get it done. Whereas when you talk to folks on the transit side, it's kind of like a murder mystery novel, and they're like trying to figure out where all the bones are buried. And again, this is not to say anything against the professionals working in this field, but it's a different animal. Some of it's because the project's different, but I think some of it is because the institutions are not as equipped to deal with these kind of complicated processes. And one of our recommendations is to lean on the expertise at federal highways and at state DOTs, because they have the institution and the culture for moving it forward. I don't know that moving project delivery completely to a state DOT is a good idea, but I do think that bringing staff over from a state DOT or running some of these processes through a division of a state DOT can be a good idea to really, if nothing else, just to leverage that existing expertise on how to do this stuff.
It feels a little bit like also infill versus sprawl. It's pretty easy to do sprawl. It's pretty easy to buy a parcel of land and meet it out. And then you don't have any opposition from neighbors necessarily. You're just kind of building it. And then you have infill, which is fraught with neighborhood complications. You have NIMBYs, you have all this stuff. How much of that plays into it? Like, you're building highways out into the periphery in areas like that. And then now we're seeing also that highways in urban areas are getting clogged up, and there's a lot more pressure on them now in Portland, in Houston, in Austin, and other places than there were previously. And so they're starting to feel the same kind of things that maybe the transit agencies were feeling.
That's true, I think, to some extent. I think the opposition to expanding a highway in an urban area is a different type of opposition than to building a light rail through a neighborhood. And there are different complexities of that, but there are a lot more simplicities involved with a highway expansion project than running or tunneling a light rail down the middle of an urban boulevard, right? I mean, utilities is, one of the biggest cost drivers of transit projects. Knowing where those utilities are, moving them, making sure everything's done in advance so that the civil construction can go quickly is a hard thing to do, and it's something that transit projects in urban areas have to take care of. Whereas, if you already have an existing highway and you're widening it a little bit, the utility relocation tends to be a much easier process.
One of the solutions you've suggested is special purpose groups or special purpose delivery vehicles. I've heard this from a number of folks. A colleague of mine who used to work at the FTA and now works for the city of San Jose, Eric Eidlin, suggested this because of he was a German Marshall Fund fellow. He found that the French were really good at this, the Germans, and suggested this for state stuff as well here in California, but it seemed to have fallen on deaf ears. I'm curious, what this recommendation means specifically and how it could be kind of implemented, because I think it is actually a good way to move forward, especially if you're given examples from other countries.
Yeah, so let me explain that recommendation. I mean, I think what matters most is that a project has really good governance. And what that means, right, is that does it have the authorities and responsibilities to move the project forward? Does it have a board of directors that's invested in the project, that is representative of the community, that can really kind of move the project forward? Does it have the right staff and the ability to attract top talent so it isn't relying on a bunch of consultants to move it forward, right? And it's kind of those authorities in terms of and structure are really important. In order to get them, sometimes you have to modify your existing transit agency to do that. And that can be really, really hard. And so in those instances where it's going to be difficult to modify your entity, creating a special purpose delivery vehicle whose board and executive director and staff, their sole mission is building out a transit project, can be a really compelling option. They use those a lot in other countries. We saw that in Madrid, in Copenhagen, Paris, Berlin. They use them in South Korea. We have some experience here in the US for sure, but they are used more often abroad, but not always, right? This is where we were talking earlier about Chile. Chile builds all of its rail transit in Santiago out of a capital division of its existing agency, right? So they don't use a special purpose delivery vehicle because they built that institution in-house and are able to use it effectively. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, but it definitely has some compelling attributes, particularly when you're unable to change your existing institution to move that project forward.
What would that look like if we created a delivery? Would it be, I guess every place is different, obviously, but would the FTA be able to create a delivery vehicle for projects that kind of it's sent around the country, like a traveling band of experts? Would it be a completely local thing where a state DOT, for example, had a delivery unit where their focus was putting projects together and making sure that they hit all the marks? Obviously, there's processes and permits and stuff that are different in every city, but it feels like, it would be helpful to have kind of a band of roving experts to a certain extent going around and making sure that projects are on time, on budget, and making sure that there's no shooting off into different directions.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the example we could use is what they've done in Los Angeles. LA has the biggest capital program in the country. Some of the current extensions of the subway system, the Purple Line, for example, the Crenshaw Line, those are being delivered directly through LA Metro in their capital division. But the Gold Line and the Expo Line were both delivered through independent construction authorities. And those projects were some of the lower cost projects in the LA region, not just because of the governance, but I think that there's some rationale for using the governance structure there as a reason for those projects being particularly low cost. And the Gold Line, we'll use that as an example. There's 3 phases of that. There's an independent entity called the Gold Line Construction Authority that has a board of directors made up of the jurisdictions in which it passes through. It coordinates very closely with LA Metro. LA Metro is the funder and the bonder. They receive those revenues. They then reimburse the Gold Line for its construction. But that is a project where the staff there are fully focused on delivering that project. And then in terms of the kind of the roving band of experts, I mean, the FTA fills that to some extent. There's 10 regional offices that the FTA has around the country. They are pretty highly regarded, the FTA staff and their project management oversight consultants that help out with projects, not just through the CIG process and setting up governance and the environmental review, but they're really an asset, I think, to these projects. I think an issue is that there are not a ton of them compared to, for example, there's 10 district offices for FTA, or I guess regional offices, if you want to be technically correct. There are 50, or I guess 52 for Federal Highway, right? Federal Highway has one in every single state capital, usually right across the street from the state DOT. So there's kind of that direct information sharing. Whereas for the Silver Line extension here in Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, the FTA regional office is in Philadelphia. And so they don't have that kind of direct interaction in the same way that Federal Highways has. And I think that there's some rationale for boosting that capacity to help at the beginning, to help set things up, and then continuing to help them through the final parts of the project.
You mentioned utilities earlier. One of the things that I think we come across often is that when there's a surface light rail line being constructed, coming to a street, all the costs of rebuilding the street, utility relocations, sidewalks are all heaped on the project costs. Is that something you saw a lot of when you were looking at project costs, was collecting all these other things that weren't necessarily related to the transit onto the project cost?
Sometimes. It really depends on the project. Utility relocation is a tricky thing because technically, by the legal basis in this country, utilities that run in a public right-of-way, they are required to pay for any relocation if the city, right, or whoever owns the road requires them to do so. So technically, any utility would have to be relocated at the expense of the entity that owns it. The problem, of course, is that a lot of utilities are publicly owned, and a lot of public, they're like, well, okay, you could make me the public, gas provider or electric provider move the wires, but then I'm going to have to increase rates on all the customers, and so then they're like, well, let's just heap it on the project because we already have the money, and so they work out some deal to use the existing funds of the project, right? And that adds costs. And I think that there's a lot of those kind of things. And then the question, of course, is, okay, so you're replacing a water main. You got a 12-inch water main going down the middle of the street. While we're digging it up, let's put in a 36-inch water main because we're expecting population growth. Does the project cover the cost of the replacement exactly as it was, or do they cover the cost of improvements to those utilities? So there's a lot of those kind of questions that every single project works out on its own. Sometimes it goes into a legal battle, and we've seen that in a bunch of different cities. Setting up those agreements at the very beginning is so crucial. And I think that's a big part of it, is setting those expectations, especially with the utility companies, because then you know what exactly to expect and the project can budget accordingly. The more challenging part, and I think you were getting at this, is some of the other betterments or things, community desires of the project. What becomes part of the project's budget versus what becomes part of the city's budget while they're digging up the street is something, again, that needs to be hashed out early, but isn't always done.
You mentioned a lot in the report complexities. Is that part of the complexity, or are they more things kind of stacked up on top of that as well?
Well, so these projects are incredibly complex, right? Because of all the things, all the different actors, the fact that they're going through urban areas, the fact that they're operating entities. It's not like you're just putting down some asphalt and hoping people drive on it, right? You're actually operating something that's going to require signaling and safety systems and all these other kind of things that are part of building a transit project. So they're very, very complex in that nature. And then on top of that, communities want a lot of things out of the project. They're going to be taking slices of property. They're going to be digging up the street. And so there's lots of demands for customization and specialization of the system to make it unique or match whatever the community is wanting. And that customization comes at a pretty steep cost. And, I think that adds a lot. And it's not just the final product, but communities often want a lot of things out of the project during construction, right? You can only work, at certain times of the day, and you have to restore street traffic during rush hour. And, a lot of things that make it really difficult to build a big project and end up escalating costs pretty quickly.
What's your biggest frustration with transit capital costs in construction, like personally? Like what hits you the hardest?
So when you get into it, I think you find that there's so many things that we could be doing just a little bit better, and it would have huge implications in the long run. And I think that it's the inefficiencies that drive you crazy as you're getting into it. So let's take an example. They're currently building the Purple Line extension in Los Angeles, going out to Santa Monica. It's a great project, going to attract a lot of people to the system. And part of that, they're tunneling underneath Wilshire Boulevard and going through Beverly Hills. And the city of Beverly Hills said to LA Metro that you are not allowed to work during the week. We want to make sure that Wilshire Boulevard is open for traffic. And so you can work on the weekends. And then at the end of the day on Sunday, you got to deck everything over so that traffic can resume. And that was a stipulation they put on the project. Then in March of 2020, with the stay-at-home orders, LA Metro convinced the city of Beverly Hills to switch to allow them to work during the week. and essentially allow 7-day-a-week construction. And in doing that little change, they finished the tunneling of the station 7 months ahead of schedule. Right. And I think that kind of rip the Band-Aid off approach we found is so much more common in other countries, right? They're like, look, we're going to be in your neighborhood. It's going to be loud. It's going to be noisy. We're going to be disruptive. And then we're going to be gone in a couple of weeks because you're going to allow us to come in here and disrupt everything. And this whole dance that we make construction companies perform to make sure that there's a minimal impact, I think ends up making it worse in the long run, because we have to endure this awfulness for so much longer. And if we would just take our mentality and just like, okay, it's going to be awful and it's going to be over, we would be so much better off in terms of costs and getting these projects done so much faster.
How much does that play into alignment decisions too?
It's a good question. And I think what agencies end up doing, and if you look at a lot of new light rail and heavy rail, a lot of them go down highway medians. A lot of them go down either underused or lightly used freight rail right-of-way. And in some instances, that can make sense. But in most cases, they're doing that because it's expedient. It's easier. It's a lot easier to put it in an existing right-of-way that nobody lives on or there's no utilities than it does down the middle of a boulevard where everyone lives. And that's where we had some problems in our data of making those apples-to-apples comparison. If you look, the Paris region is building a ton of light rail, and so is the US. A lot of what we build is light rail. But when you look at the projects in Paris, they are putting these down the middle of boulevards in historic neighborhoods with a ton of density, and they're taking away lanes from cars, and they're moving utilities, and they're doing it at a fraction of the cost than it takes us to build along the side of a freeway. And I think that kind of exacerbates, we found that there's a premium in the US, but I think in reality, it's a lot bigger because it's hard to differentiate the types of projects that we're building, even if it's all at grade, for example.
The construction costs, also, there's another interesting discussion that you all had about contracts, especially from a piece that you wrote in October that really piqued my interest. It seems there's a drawback to contracting with one company to do a whole project, and unbundling is imminently beneficial. How are other countries benefiting from separating out projects and doing segments of lines and contracting that with one company and then contracting with another company to do the stations, making sure that the segments are small? How much benefit is there from that unbundling, as it were?
It's a great question. And it's something that we weren't expecting to find as part of this. But the premise, at least, is here in the United States. We tend to say, okay, we've got a 10-mile train line, and we're going to let a massive design build contract to have one designer come in. We have one contractor. We can manage this whole thing very expediently and build the whole thing in one fell swoop. And there's some rationale to that for sure. When we started talking to other countries, that type of procurement is actually really rare. And in fact, you rarely see a single contract for more than 150 or $200 million. And I'll use Chile as an example. And I think this is a big part of why they've been successful, at least in their context. They have a 10-mile subway extension. What they'll do is they'll take that 10 miles and they'll divide it into 5 different contracts. And so they'll do all the design, and then they'll let the construction contracts out for the civil works in 2-mile segments, more or less. And no 2 tunnelers are able to have adjoining contracts, and no 2 tunnelers are able to have more than 2 contracts on the whole line. So you encourage this competition. Because the contracts are no more than $150 or $200 million, smaller companies can participate in a way that, there's only a few huge design builders that can build a, $100 or $2 billion line. And if there's a problem with a contract or a contractor, they can resolve it or they can cancel that contract and bring in one of the other contractors to finish the line, right? We saw that here with the Purple Line in Maryland, where you've got now a $3 billion contract. They had a disagreement, and so work stopped for a year. Right? They had this, huge structures sitting there in the sky with nobody working on them for over a year while they're trying to do this contract dispute. Had that been divided up into a lot of smaller segments, they would have been able to reassign that contract and work would have proceeded regardless. So it gives the agency a lot of leverage, but it's also, I think it's important to recognize, it's harder to manage. So you have to spend more time and resources hiring public agency staff to make sure that those connections between all the contractors, between all the stations, between the civil works that then involve into laying track and signaling systems is well coordinated. And so it takes a little bit more of a public sector skill set that we don't necessarily invest in. But I think that investment in other countries has certainly paid off. And not to say that it's the silver bullet. And I think that there's some great examples of design build or progressive design build or P3s that can achieve really impressive projects. But this seems to be a really good way at giving the agency more leverage and more competition, frankly, when building these projects.
Is there a good way to advocate for agencies to get more of their own staff to focus on this? I know a lot of times they, will hire out because they're doing one project at a time. And so they feel like, it's not important to have staff on board. But I feel like that's kind of a common theme that I've seen is having more in-house staff seems to help over the long term.
Yeah, and that's something that we definitely agree with in our paper, especially at the project management side. Those really have to be public sector staff, and they have to be real well qualified. And I think we've seen from abroad, you can attract those people because they want to work on the next big project, right? And they're not looking to sit in an agency for 50 years or whatever, right? And not to say that that's a bad thing, but the people that want to lead these big projects are attracted to the work. And so the issue is that agencies often have salary caps and can't attract that top talent from around the world to come work for them. And so that's where the, changing that dynamic or creating a special purpose delivery vehicle that doesn't have the same constraints can be really helpful in attracting that staff. And this is, again, I think consultants provide tremendous amount of expertise. And I think that, and our recommendations is definitely in line with having consultants perform discrete tasks and help out on specific things. But in terms of project management, that really needs to be squarely in public sector capacity.
How important is community engagement to this process overall? It seems like something that's come up a lot lately.
So community engagement is one of those things that is super critical to a project. I mean, if you look at the history of community engagement in this country, you see it's pretty fraught with some pretty poor decisions in transportation. And the environmental review process does now require that community engagement is part of planning and project decisions. I think the recommendations in the paper are twofold. I think we need to invest more in community engagement, and that's not just doing more public meetings, but it's actually hiring staff that are dedicated to that component of the project, that serve as those community liaisons, that answer questions, that kind of meet community where they are, and do so in a transparent manner, so that investment in community engagement is also coupled with empowerment of agency staff to say no to certain things from the community. And again, not to say that recommendations from the community are not important. They should be documenting those interactions very transparently. But ultimately, in order for a project to move forward, agency has to make some tough decisions, and staff need to be empowered to make those decisions based on their expertise, the trust that we've given them as public servants, along with the documentation that they have of community engagement. And I think that's where we miss the mark, right? We either don't engage the community enough and make too many decisions in the ivory tower, or we defer to community demands too much to the detriment of the project. And so striking that right balance is so critical to a project moving forward in an effective way.
It's interesting thinking about community engagement as it pertains to, say, something like the alternatives analysis and the theater that goes along with that sometimes because of alignments that are already chosen, route technologies that are chosen. It feels like that part of reforming community engagement to a certain extent is reforming the process of thinking regionally about projects as a whole. Do you find that to be the case as well?
For sure. And I think the concept that we've really focused on in our paper is that the community engagement piece needs to happen earlier and more direct. We tend to not make or finalize a lot of decisions in the planning process. And we say, okay, well, we'll resolve that in the environmental review and the alternatives analysis. And that's where you end up with projects that have, 15 or 25 or 35 different alternatives that are reviewed, where an environmental review document really should just be a couple final alignments or alternatives that you're considering. The other decisions should be made in the community engagement process associated with the planning process done before that. And for whatever reason, lots of different reasons, we tend to push too much of that onto the environmental review process, which ends up making these documents hugely long and so impenetrable and not particularly useful to moving forward in a responsible way.
How much does the need to have a vote to pay for a lot of these projects cause problems? So, for example, you have to have an election in Seattle, in Los Angeles, in Austin to actually pay for these massive network projects that they're putting together. But in order to have a vote, you have to have enough information for the voters to vote on. Whereas in the highway world, they're building a highway, they're going to do it whether you vote, you know, you don't have to vote for it. How much does that play into that whole, rigmarole as well?
It's a good question. And I think that it's tied up into some of the expectations we put on transit versus highways, for sure. I think part of it is that in order to get people to increase their taxes to pay for transit, you've got to show them what they're getting. It can be effective if you do the community engagement, if you have a solid plan in place, then people know what they're voting for. They're on board with it. And in some cases, it then gives the agency a mandate to do the project that the voters voted for. Of course, that can get messy when you start actually making designs, right? They're not voting on a design, they're voting on a high-level plan. But that's I think a really interesting and valid question. I'm not exactly sure how it would play out.
It's also interesting when you have quote unquote community partners that end up rejecting the project and then the project dies. Duke University comes to mind as one. There's others as well around the country. That type of thing doesn't necessarily happen on highway projects as well. And I don't want to dwell on the highway versus transit discussion as it's something that gets talked about a lot, but those types of little kind of tweaks can be frustrating.
Agreed.
What's been the response to this work so far? How have people responded to the findings and what you all are discussing?
It's been really interesting. We've briefed a lot of organizations. I think that there's a recognition that we need to crack this nut and figure out how to change the paradigm. I think a lot of agencies that are building, especially with the IIJA and unprecedented amounts of money coming from federal programs to invest in this kind of stuff, people want to make sure that they can do it effectively. And so we've had a lot of briefings, a couple of follow-on projects with some of the regions around the country that are building big things and want to use this and use other examples as a good way to tackle the issue. And I think this is where I've learned a lot because I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people about this subject, but I've never built a big project. And so part of my role is when the questions start to get really specific, beyond the scope of our paper, that's where we like to connect people with the builders and the project managers and constructors from around the world that have done this successfully, that we've learned from. So an agency isn't trying to learn through us, but directly from the people that have done this well from the start.
What's something that you've been surprised about when you're doing the research? I mean, I know you've been coming across a number of findings. The contracts was interesting and something a little bit different, but is there something that popped out that really was surprising in doing the research and in cataloging the projects and talking to all these folks around the world?
I think there's a lot of surprising things because anytime you talk to other people in the world, you really learn so much. One thing that's stood out to me is the value of just talking to other people or frankly, writing other systems. Because of COVID, we did not have the opportunity to travel to some of these places, but spent a lot of time looking on Google Maps and talking to people in places like Copenhagen, right? And this is one really cool example of a totally different paradigm for building a project, but also one that isn't trying to reinvent the wheel. The system in Copenhagen feels much more like an automated people mover at an airport than it does a big metro, but it has the capacity because they used off-the-shelf automated people movers from an Italian manufacturer. Every station is exactly the same. Because they're automated, the trains come every 90 seconds. So they make up a lot of the capacity in that way. And because they had small trains, they were able to kind of shoehorn this into a historic city and build a metro system from scratch. And again, they didn't do anything new. In fact, they really just kind of copied what other places had done and just put it all together and did it really effectively. And I think the temptation here in the United States is that every region's unique. Every transit need is unique. And so we need totally customized transit vehicles and we need totally customized train stations. And so we kind of close our eyes and we don't look at what other people have done. Whereas just, copy paste is sometimes one of the most effective ways. at saving a lot of money because the plans and the details and the outcomes are already there.
I enjoy riding on that metro, because it's a people mover, there's a glass front to it and you can look out towards the track and just kind of be mesmerized by the tunnel. And usually there's the driver there that gets that view. But in the Copenhagen metro, you get that view yourself, which is, for a transit nerd, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, they have the same thing if you go to Vancouver.
Yep, in the SkyTrain too.
Right? It's a very high capacity system because anytime they need a train, they can hit a button and the train moves, right? You've taken some of the workforce challenges associated with scheduling out of the picture. You reduce costs. It's a very safe system. They have attendants in a lot of the stations and sometimes on the trains to keep things safe, but it's a system that's remarkably usable.
Let's hope Hawaii can finish soon.
I know.
Well, where can folks find the report if they want to get their hands on it?
Yeah, so the report is available for free download on our website, enotrans.org. If you go to projectdelivery.enotrans.org, you can view the download or view the web version, and then there's also a version to download. And of course, if you have any specific questions, you can reach out to me directly. My email is plewis, Lewis, @enotrans.org.
Awesome. Well, Paul, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.